The first protest that I went to was an anti-nuclear march, and I was 10. It was 1980. Don't do the maths. And I remember being there with my cousins and my activist auntie, and we were chanting, "Keep uranium in the ground, no to nuclear war." It was that year that Sydney City Council deemed Sydney to be nuclear free. And then and there I realised the power of protest. Fast forward, with many protests in between, to 2000, where armed with 250,000 colleagues, we crossed the Sydney Harbour Bridge to say sorry to the Indigenous population of Australia. And I remember that moment of solidarity, that feeling together with strangers that was replicated, in fact, in 2011 when I was in Cairo after I co-founded my organisation with Egyptian colleagues during the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square. That was really the year that the protest that I was at when the government hit back hard. I can still taste the rubble and the grit, the poison in my eyes when a gas bomb exploded at close quarters. And they even gassed a makeshift hospital that was in the laneway that had been set up to deal with peaceful protesters who had been injured. In fact, many of the people who were at that protest are still in prison. My colleague, Alaa Abdel Fattah, is one of those people, and I spoke to his cousin just a few weeks ago about his unlawful and continuing detention. So I'm committed to the right to peaceful protest because it's really a gateway right. It's a right that onboards you to others. It's the right that enables you to meet with friends, with cousins, with strangers, and to stand firm for your rights in whichever realm it might be. Now, maybe you've never been to a protest. Maybe you don't ever intend to. But the experience that you have, the rights that you enjoy, are the result of others exercising that right to protest for you. So if you are a woman who votes, and maybe I can just get a show of hands, how many women here who vote, right? Well, it's the suffragette movement of 100 years ago that we should acknowledge for your voting rights. We should understand, thank you. And at the same time, if you work a 40-hour week, it's the labour movement that's responsible for putting worker rights on the agenda. And if you're a member of the LGBT community, it's that night on the 28th of June, 1969, when proud trans, black and brown and other activists stood firm against police brutality. And I myself stand here as a proud gay man and wish to acknowledge those people on that night in the early hours. Now, we need to remember that peaceful protest has been experienced all around the world. So it's, the Vietnam War protests. It's the right for racial justice, social justice, climate justice. And on many of those protests, we've actually won. In fact, the history of contemporary world is signposted with all of these events and all of these protests that have enabled us to live the life that we live today. But it's not just a nice to have. It's actually international law. Article 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights makes it clear that everybody in this room and everybody watching has the right to protest, to peaceful assembly and association. And so it is our responsibility to try to ensure that that right survives. Because if the current contour of our society is based on the protests that happened before, the question we need to ask is, what will our future society look like in the absence of protest today? And it's one of the reasons actually why I co-founded my organisation, because our mission is to defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk. We sit at the intersection of human rights and new technology. And in fact, something significant has changed. Sure, we've always had people, men largely, who have tried to deny the will of their citizens. But with the advent of new technology, with the internet, with digitalisation, particularly as a result of the pandemic, digitalising everything, every part of our lives, the question that we need to ask is, will the right to protest survive its migration online? And sure, it's universal, but is the right to protest digital? So no one is inviting you to a protest these days by letter. No one is sticking stamps on envelopes to get you to come. Protests are organised in the online environment. They're organised by TikTok, by Insta, by WhatsApp, by Facebook. From Myanmar to India, the model is the same. And in fact, it's why the Russian government under Putin is doing everything it can do to disable those platforms, because they know that the protest movement, the opposition movement under Navalny gathers online. But it's not just the gathering or the protest, the organising of the protest that's the issue here. I mean, it's part of the issue. The other half of it is that protest is now moving online itself. So the Al-Aqsa protests for the Palestinian movement happens under that Al-Aqsa hashtag. Similarly, the climate strike has happened online, particularly as a result of Greta Thunberg's shift during the pandemic into the digital environment. And the Black Lives Matter protests that happen are happening through a whole generation of new people who are experiencing it through TikTok. As this transition happens, we are at a moment in time. We're at a moment that we need to think about, because if it's true that our society is framed and formed by these protests that have happened in the past, then we need to ensure that as that transition moves into the digital sphere, that we have the rights confirmed, that we have the companies understanding what those rights are, and that we have the states who are currently legislating and creating new laws, that we have those things in place to ensure that migration. And I want to put three things on the table for you, three things to think about. One is the issue of connectivity. Only 60% of the world's population is currently online. That means 40%, 3.5 billion people, aren't actually in the space where they might claim their rights. So, for instance, if the blacker you are, the less likely you are to be online, fact. Or if you're a woman, the less likely you are to be online than a man, again, fact. And the more likely you are to have access to dumb technologies, then how do you claim racial justice? How do you claim your rights to pay equity or to ensure that there is no gender-based violence in the digital environment if you're not even there? So challenge number one, we need to ensure that the world's population is online, because it's not just a question of numbers. The people who are offline are the rural, are the poor, are the disaffected, the rarely consulted and the exploited. We need to ensure that 3.5 billion people, and it's not that they need to be online, it's that they need to have the choice to be online. The second issue, it's not just about connectivity, it's also about shutdowns. Now, you may not be tracking this in the same way as I am, but there was 155 internet shutdowns last year across 59 countries. So when people may be online, but doesn't mean that they will actually stay that way. These are intentional disruptions of the network. So what we see is that in our research is that the number one reason why governments shut down the internet is to stop protest. The third issue that I want to put on the agenda, which is turn the internet on for all, keep the internet on for all. The third, perhaps most concerning issue is that of surveillance. Right now, governments are collecting data on all of us, together with companies. We know that. We've seen that in real time. But it's actually worse in the context of a protest. So your faces, your biometrics, your eyes, your irises, your gait, the way that you walk, your voice are being collected. And when we think about the role of the state, in the context of protest, new technologies are emerging all the time. What we see is that governments are, in the middle of protest, emerging fake radio towers that trick your device into sending data, your location, your identity, your conversations. And in the context of that, the problem, of course, is what happens to anonymity. Because anonymity is the foundation of privacy, and privacy is the bedrock of our democracy. Governments are also buying and selling data from private sector, which enables the identity of an individual to be connected to their home address. Again, what is the future of the Egyptian democracy movement in that context? What is the future of LGBT activists in Uganda who are fearful of being identified and located? So the problems are multi-headed. We have the problem of connectivity, we have the problem of internet shutdowns, we have the problem of surveillance. So what happens to all of that data? Where does it end up? What happens to Greta Thunberg's generation that is looking for climate change action from governments? Well, in a way, and perhaps depressingly, we need to look no further than the Uyghur movement, the Uyghur population in China. But at the same time, this is, as I said before, a moment in time. Governments are making decisions about the regulations and the laws, and companies are deciding about the human rights implications of their platforms and what policies and practices they should have in place. So let me bring you back to the 10-year-old who was on the streets of Sydney. How would he respond to a current situation? Well, I, for one, would be very excited about having all of these technologies at my fingertips to be able to use WhatsApp to design a placard for the following day's protest in Sydney against to ensure that we keep uranium in the ground. But what are all the 10-year-olds whose future lies and hangs in the balance? What about all of us whose future lies in the balance? If we can agree that current society's confines is determined by the protests of the past, then how do we ensure that all of us have that safe and welcome opportunity of a future? There are hundreds of organisations around the world, like Access Now, that are fighting these battles in real time so that the future society that we live in is positively guarded and guided by the protest and the expression that we're able to safely engage in today. Thank you very much.